Across the Fence, we'll be talking about this book, The Man from Vermont, Charles Ross Taggart, The Old Country Fiddler. It's the story of a traveling entertainer who made a career sharing his various talents with audiences all over the country in the early 20th century. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. Charles Ross Taggart grew up in East Topsham, Vermont in the 1870s. He went on to become a musical humorist who played the fiddle and various other instruments. He was also known for his impersonations, ventriloquism, and storytelling. Taggart is no longer a familiar name to most of us, but 100 years ago he was well on his way to becoming a recording star. He even appeared in an early talking movie, which we'll see a portion of a little bit later on. Taggart's remarkable story might have been lost or forgotten were it not for the work of a man from West Windsor, Vermont. It is a pleasure to welcome Adam Boyce, the author of The Man from Vermont. Welcome. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, how did you discover Charles Ross Taggart?
Actually, quite accidentally. I found him through an internet search about 14 years ago. And later I found an interview that he had done for the Vermonter magazine in November of 1927. And I kind of put him on the back burner for a while, and then 2009 I decided he would make a good living history character, so I developed him into that, which I present primarily through the humanities in both Vermont and New Hampshire. I dress up as his old country fiddler character, doing some fiddling and some of his humorous material, as well as telling his life and career story in his own words.
Well, it really is a fascinating story, too. Why did you write the book?
Well, it was sort of the byproduct. I had accumulated so much information on someone who was so obscure and found I couldn't deliver this in just a single presentation somewhere. So I decided, since there weren't any books about him, that he deserved one.
And so how did he become an entertainer?
Well, he was inspired by watching a traveling one-man entertainer in the neighboring town of Groton in 1895. And this same man would be his mentor. Charlie was so inspired and wanted to try himself out in front of an audience, which he did on October 8th, 1895, was his first performance at the Topsham Town Hall in East Topsham Village. But bearing in mind, Charlie Taggart didn't really have very much experience being in front of an audience and didn't have a lot of musical experience, but he managed to put together a program which was a great success, and it launched him into going into the Lyceum circuits in Boston, New York City, and eventually all across the country. And he wrote all of these letters back home to the editors of local newspapers, so he became somewhat of a freelance travel correspondent as well as an entertainer.
Now, there are a lot of photographs that you have in your book, and you've brought a few to share that sort of talk about his diversity and show his diversity
Yes.
as an entertainer.
Okay, this one is, well, this is actually one of Taggart and his daughter. That was in 1928. That was a Chautauqua circuit that they went on. His youngest daughter also played the violin, just like he did.
That was in the latter part of his career.
That was in the latter part of his career, yes.
But at first, I mean, he did all kinds of things. I mean, trick photography was one of the things that he was involved in, which
Yes.
back in the day was very unusual.
Yes, and he doesn't really talk about how he got into doing this, but he was actually quite good at it, and he actually specialized in scenic or landscape images.
And back in the day, tell us a little bit about what was going on socially, where these kinds of entertainers were sort of roaming the country as entertainment.
Well, they weren't very common, certainly in Vermont in the 1890s, and he found he wasn't going to be a success staying in Vermont, unfortunately. So he did have to branch out. Most of the people that he would have gone and performed for in the Lyceum or in the Chautauqua circuits, it's basically something like the Osher Center for Lifelong Learning today. People pay a subscription and they would hear all of these different presenters. And so the people who listened to him would have been, the God-fearing types, the progressive types out in the Midwest. And, again, before there was things like television and the other entertainment that we now take for granted, this was very important. People came primarily to hear speakers, but entertainers were fine as long as they were inexpensive enough.
Okay, very good. Let's see if we can get to some of those pictures now that you brought with to show us.
Okay. This is Charlie Taggart from around 1910. just after he had been added to the Redpath Lyceum and Chautauqua Bureau out of Chicago, which was his primary employer for over 20 years.
And the next picture?
That's my favorite of Charlie Taggart as his old country fiddler character. He wasn't really an old country fiddler, he just portrayed one. But this is a kind of a dig at the Victor dog Nipper, who was advertised as hearing his master's voice. And the caption was, "The old country fiddler hears his own voice," advertising the fact that he put out a number of records with the Victor Company.
And of course, this is you in character.
No, this is actually Mr. Taggart himself.
Oh, that is Mr. Taggart. Okay. Let's take a look at another photograph.
And that is Taggart on the bench with his youngest daughter, Elizabeth, on their Elm Bank property in Newbury, where the family moved to by 1907. He had constructed a number of paths and benches all over the property. The Taggarts very much enjoyed mountain climbing and recreational activities.
Okay, let's see if there's another one.
And there's Charlie in his office at Elm Bank, right around sometime in the 1920s, where he would write to prospective sponsors, inquiring about his itineraries, and also maybe answering some fan mail.
Now here's one of the pictures that is later in his career.
Yes, Charlie was having a hard time getting bookings, and the Redpath decided to try to add 2 fiddlers to his routine, and so it was advertised as Charles Ross Taggart and his old-time country fiddlers, or his Fiddlers 3. Charlie wasn't very thrilled with the idea because he had been a solo performer, and they did have a couple of good seasons, but it wasn't enough to turn the tide.
So in 1924, Taggart was in an early talking movie. He was doing one of his monologues, which he called The Old Country Fiddler at the Singing School. Take a look at that.
Wonder how many of you folks ever attended an old-fashioned singing school in the country. I went to one once years ago, and we learned an old-time song, and I'd like mighty well to have you hear it. Now you listen. You see, the women sung the air to it in them days, and I sung the bass, but I've got to sing the air on it now. The bass don't sound very good alone. There ain't no women here to sing. It's originally written in G, but I have to play it in C. It goes so blamed high, I can't reach up there. I have to play it where I can. If I don't, I get mixed up. Oh, Jacob gets the cows home and puts them in the pens. There's 4 verses to it. You take it clear through. I just sing the first verse and the chorus. That's all I ever learned. Just that much. Oh, chorus, best part of it. You can tell that chorus as soon as you hear it. Oh, yes, that goes fine. Oh, this ain't the chorus I'm singing now, you understand. Oh, no, I ain't got to that yet. I'll be there in a minute. You'll hear it. Oh, Jacob gets the cows home, puts them in the pen, for the cousins are coming for to see us all again. And the doubt is in the pan, and the turkey's on the fire, and we all must get ready for Cousin Jedediah. Here's the chorus, Cousin Jedediah. There's Jedediah and Azariah and Azariah and Jeremiah, all are coming here to be. Want to have a jolly time, I want to have a jolly time. Jerusalem, put the kids along, we'll all take tea. Ain't that a dandy? By jinks, I always liked that old song. You know, you take these modern songs all full of harems and vamps and pajamas, they don't appeal to me not a bit. I like them old-timers. Well, I guess I better play you a classical piece. I'll give you one I know named Pop Goes the Weasel. It's a beauty.
That's footage of Charles Ross Taggart, if you're just joining us, and I'm visiting with Adam Boyce of West Windsor, who's written a book about Taggart and his career. We were talking about the music, but he was also as a photographer, we mentioned earlier. We'd like to take a look at some of his pictures because they're somewhat unusual.
Sure. This is Charles Ross Taggart, both people in the picture. This was around 1905, we think, in front of the Topsom Town Hall. Charlie in his normal traveling attire on the right, and then some farmer character he created on the left. But he was quite a master of putting these together, as we'll see in the next photo also. There he is in same outfit, but it's still pretty amazing for the time period. And he doesn't mention really how he got started doing this, but he could have been the town photographer.
Mm-hmm. And so early on in his career, he was traveling a lot, but then later in his career, it almost seemed like the entertainment form had changed and he wasn't quite as relevant.
Right, and you had to either adapt or you were going to be left behind, and he was old enough that he was pretty set in his ways, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And so tell us about his home life when he wasn't performing.
Well, he had a number of home interests, including photography, hunting, mountain climbing, and he just liked being off because, again, he was gone for 10 to 15 weeks at a time and probably more during the course of the year. So he always valued his time at home.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about his career. And it wasn't a very long one.
Well, it was over 43 years,
well.
starting
so that's good.
Relatively,
yeah.
From 1895. Really, his high point was the 20s, mm-hmm. and the Chautauqua circuits were his best format. But he did do a little radio. He did make these records for Victor primarily and other places. So he had somewhat of a legacy, and he made a fairly good income, had a nice house in Newbury, put 3 daughters through college, had a car. So it was sort of a mixed blessing, but it was a real trade-off being gone that long from your family. But it was just something he had to do.
And his daughter, I guess, joined him at one point?
Yes, we saw a clip of her earlier. She graduated from Grinnell out in Iowa with a degree in music, and like her father, she played the fiddle, but she never kept it up professionally.
Now, in addition to writing the book, you've helped to get Charlie Taggart some recognition.
Yes, on October 8th, 2011, we placed 2 markers to him, and I think there's the image of the one on the town hall in East Topsom that my wife and I donated, the place where he gave his very first performance in 1895. Mm-hmm. And later that same day, we dedicated this marker over in Newbury beside his former home, Elm Bank. We had Governor Shumlin declare the day Charles Ross Taggart Day in the state of Vermont, and we had a pretty good crowd of people. More came for the Topsom part of it than the Newbury part, but they were still very interested and very glad that he was being recognized.
Do people still know about him? I mean, before your book, did people in these towns remember?
The ones who actually saw him as a performer or knew him are fading, very, very few. Most of them, it's either their mother, their grandmother, their great-grandmother might have actually seen him. But of course, with the passing of time, that number is dwindling. But, probably half the people in Topsom had heard of him, the other half had no idea who he was. So he has kind of a mixed legacy. I mean, he just kind of faded out, and not very many articles or writings about him, and I think he's a pretty critical part of our cultural past. I was
just going to say, why do you think it's important for folks to remember who he was?
Well, I mean, it's really a true American success story. You have somebody who takes an idea and they run with it. They make a living doing what they enjoy. And the old saying is, when you do that, you'll never work another day in your life. And for Charlie, that was mostly the case. I mean, despite putting up with sometimes not very good conditions where he traveled or how he got to these places. How he ever came back from some of these places is remarkable. And he tells in the book, through these letters, just remarkable stories of, he could have been killed in some of these travels, traveling on the front of a flat car, going over 80-foot trestles, down in the Cumberland Mountains of Tennessee. So it is really a remarkable story.
And if people are interested in finding the book, where can they find it?
Well, anywhere on the World Wide Web, if you Google that name in, but also by visiting www.historypress.net. Also, if anybody is interested in having me come to their nonprofit organization and give my living history portrayal of Mr. Taggart, you can call me at 802-484-7719.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and sharing his story.
Thank you.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.